Hey, what's up guys? I'm Ryan from American Trucks, and today I'm here with the Fabtech 4-inch budget suspension lift kit with shocks fitting your 2014 to 2018 Chevy Silverado 1500. This is going to be for the truck owner that is looking for some additional ground clearance for a very reasonable price. This is perfect for the budget-minded enthusiast that's looking for some additional height as well as more of an aggressive stance. This kit is going to give you more tire defender clearance, which is going to allow you to fit larger tires up to a 33-inch tire, and of course it's going to allow for more suspension articulation. This whole kit is designed for a smooth, steady, and quiet ride, and it maintains that factory ride quality somewhat since we're reusing the factory struts. This comes complete as a kit with pretty much everything you'll need to install, and there is a lot of modification to get this thing installed, but I talk about all that stuff in the installation video. Now, currently this kit is around $700 on the site, which is pretty reasonable when compared to other options, and not a bad option to go with. As far as installation goes, I'm going to give this a very strong 2 out of 3 wrenches on the difficulty meter. Now with that being said, let's hop into the install. Tools we use for this install: dead blow hammer, regular hammer, tape measure, a drill, half-inch drive impact, half-inch drive breaker bar, pry bar, various socket extensions, 5/16 drill bit, half-inch drill bit, standard and metric socket set, half-inch drive ratchet, 3/8 drive ratchet, 1/4-inch drive ratchet, flathead screwdriver, cut-off wheel, bungee, safety glasses, standard and metric wrench set, Sharpie, and a crayon, channel locks, vice grips, wire cutters. So we already got our truck up on the lift and we pulled our wheels and tires off. Now if you're doing this on the ground, you can jack your truck up, make sure that you support it with jack stands. We're gonna get started on the disassembly. The first thing we're gonna do is start disconnecting some of these lines. That way when we take all this stuff apart, we're not gonna pull on them and rip them. So we're gonna start with this bracket right here on the upper control arm. You're gonna have one bolt in there. We're gonna use a 10mm socket to get that out. Next thing we're going to do is follow this ABS line up to this other bracket. We want to free that up and then we're going to unplug it. So you can use a flathead screwdriver or any kind of pry tool to get underneath of there. Once we get that out, we're going to need to push that little red locking tab out and then disconnect it. Once that tab's pushed out, there's going to be a little black tab right here. You can push in on that, and that's going to allow you to disconnect that plug. Next, we want to free it up from this bracket. So we're just going to pry that out there as well. Next, we're going to remove our sway bar end leg. So we're going to use a 15mm wrench for this nut up here, 15mm socket for the bolt head. Next, we're going to remove our tie rod end. So we're going to use a 21mm socket to get that nut off. If this happens to spin, you can either stick a socket on here and use a wrench, or actually we're going to pry down on this and try to get that to seat so we can get that nut off. So since we have to disconnect our upper control arm and this whole assembly is going to swing out, we don't want to separate this joint for the 4-wheel drive axle. So what we're going to do before we do that is we're going to disconnect it from our differential. So we're going to remove a series of bolts using a 15mm socket, and that way this whole thing will swing out. So to get this thing to rotate around, you can just spin the axle. You can just pull that out and it'll swing down. After you get that axle out, next thing we're going to do is disconnect this upper ball joint from our spindle. So we're going to use an 18mm wrench to get this nut off, and then we'll crack that free. So you want to make sure that this nut comes all the way off. Once you get it all the way off, you can put it on a few threads, and then we're going to break this free. And then we're gonna tap right here on the spindle, and that's gonna pop that out, hopefully. After you crack that free, we're gonna pry that back in. Take that nut off. Then we can allow that upper control arm to come all the way out. So the next thing we're gonna do is support our lower control arm. That way we can take the 2 bolts out of the bottom of the strut. Now you don't need to put much tension on this. We just want it to keep it from swinging down when we take these bolts out. So if you have the factory setup and it's untouched, most likely you're gonna have a captured nut up here, and you'll have a 15mm bolt that goes up through the bottom. Ours look to have been replaced, so I'm gonna use some different tools. So next thing we're gonna do is remove the top of the strut. You're gonna have 3 nuts up there. We're gonna use an 18mm wrench to get those off. After you get the strut out, the next thing we're gonna do is remove our upper control arm. So you're gonna need a 21mm wrench and a 21mm socket. We're gonna take each bolt out of each side. So we're gonna hold the bolt still, we're gonna unscrew the nut from it. We'll pull those out and get this thing out of there. After that, we're gonna slide these 2 cam sections off. We can put those back on just to reassemble them and just put that bolt on. That way we don't lose any of this stuff. So we're gonna hold the control arm as we get that last bolt out. And we can pull this whole thing out of the truck. So the next step in this process is to cut this droop stop off. We need to make room for our new control arm, so we're gonna use a cutoff wheel. If you don't have a cutoff wheel and an air compressor, you can use a Sawzall. I'm gonna show you how to do that right now. So once you get that bracket cut off, that is basically gonna wrap up everything for this wheel well. We're gonna do those same exact steps for the other side. After you're done that, we're gonna go underneath with some disassembly and some modification. So next, since we have to remove our cross member and we gotta get that differential out, we're gonna remove this skid plate. So they're gonna have 6 large bolts in here. We're gonna use a 15mm socket to take each one of those out and pull that skid plate off. So you wanna grab onto this thing when we take that last bolt out. Next, we're gonna take the cross member off. This has 2 bolts on either side. We're gonna use an 18mm wrench and an 18mm socket. So at this point in time, you probably want to take your gloves off. We're going to unplug this plug right here. This is for our differential. So you're going to have this little tiny red locking tab. We're going to take a flathead screwdriver and we're just going to pry that out some, just a little bit. Once we get that out, we can push on that and that's going to allow us to unplug that. So next thing we have to do is remove our drive shaft because like I said, we have to get this whole differential out. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take a crayon and we're gonna mark this. That way when we put it back in, we can put it back in the same exact spot. So we're just gonna make a little mark on this end cap right here and then a little mark on the yoke. After that, you're gonna have 4 bolts. There's 2 end caps. Each end cap's gonna have 2 bolts. We're gonna use an 11mm socket to remove both of those and then we'll set that drive shaft aside with a bungee cord. So after that, we're gonna slide this back. You wanna make sure that these end caps do not fall off. There's little tiny needle bearings inside of there. You wanna make sure that they stay on. So the next thing we're gonna do is remove our steering rack. So the first thing that we're gonna do is disconnect our steering column from the rack. It's that little tiny bolt up there. We're gonna use an 11mm socket to get that out. After we get that out, we can push the steering column up and off. So next we're gonna disconnect our wiring. So you're gonna have these 2 plugs over here, one here, one here. We're gonna free both of these spots up from the frame and then we'll unplug these. So we're gonna start with this plug over here. Now to unplug that, you're gonna need to push this red locking tab up, then you can press down on this lever. Next we're gonna do this one over here. You're gonna have this little lever back here. So we're gonna just pick up on that with a flathead screwdriver. We're gonna twist this around. We're gonna take this red locking tab, pull that out, and we can press in on this. So after we get everything disconnected, we're gonna start with the removal of the bolts. We're gonna start with these 2 big bolts here. We're gonna use a 15/16 socket to get those out. We're gonna take these last 2 bolts. You're gonna have 1 bolt up here and 1 bolt through this hole in the frame. I'm gonna get Tony to hold this thing for me while I use an 18mm socket to take those out. And we're gonna slide it to one side so we can get one of the tie rods out. Then we'll take the whole thing out and down. So after you get the steering rack out, the next thing we're gonna do is take the differential out. So you're gonna have 2 21mm nuts over here, and we're gonna have 2 18mm bolts. We're gonna support this thing with a pole jack. As we get it down, we're gonna pull off the vent tube and disconnect any lines that are attached to this thing. Once you get all that hardware off, we're gonna lower the pole jack down. So next we're gonna take this passenger side diff mount out. You're gonna have two studs. One's gonna be over here, one is back here. We're gonna use an 18mm socket or wrench for the top, and we're gonna use an 18mm socket for the bottom. So after you get this mount out, the next thing we have to do is we have to press these studs out. We are putting a spacer block in here to drop the differential down, and these are not going to be long enough. So what we're going to do is stick it in a vise, put the nuts back on there, and then we're going to smack them out. Once you get that to knock out of there, you can take that nut back off, and then that'll just pull out. So with the installation of this lift kit, we have multiple things that we need to cut. First thing that we're going to start off with cutting is the differential. Now this is the driver's side, and right underneath of the yoke on the bottom side of this, you're going to have these two fins sticking out. We need to clearance these fins because when we drop this whole thing down, we don't want it to hit the cross member. So we're going to take a cut-off wheel and we're going to cut most of these off. So the next section we need to cut off on this differential is still on the bottom. It's going to be on the opposite side, and you're going to have this corner here. We need to cut this corner off just a little bit above the bolt. So we're going to do that right now. I'll show you how to do that. So now that we're all done cutting the diff, the next thing we're going to do is modify our power steering rack. So you're going to have this electronic module with these three plugs. We need to trim the edge of this piece off. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to unplug all of these, move them out of the way, and then we'll start cutting. So we're just going to press down on these tabs to unplug these and swing them out of the way. This one has this red locking tab, so you'll need to slide that back. Then we can press down on that, get that unplugged. This one has a little white locking tab. We need to unlock that as well. Basically, we have to cut in between here and here. We need to take some of this out. Next thing we're going to do is cut the cross member. So what we're going to do is grab a tape measure and a Sharpie. We've already cleaned off a little area of our cross member, and we're going to measure over from this bolt hole. So you want this slanted side facing towards you, and we're going to be on the right side. So we're going to measure over from the center of this bolt hole 2 3/4 of an inch. We'll make a mark, and then from that we're going to measure over 3 1/2 inches. So from that line, we measure over 3 1/2 inches, and we want to make the bottom of our line 1/4 inch up from the bottom. Now from that bottom line, we're going to measure 1 5/8 up. So the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna go back under the truck. We're gonna go to the driver's side, and this cross member frame mount, we need to cut a section out of this. What we're gonna do is we're gonna take our tape measure, and we're gonna mark out some areas and then cut a section out of there. So you're gonna have these two holes on the front side. We're gonna measure 3/4 of an inch up from the top of those. So we're gonna do that and then make a mark. After that, we're gonna measure 2 3/4 back. So from this line where we marked 3/4, we're gonna measure up and around 2 3/16. So after you mark that whole section off, we're gonna take our cut-off wheel and we're gonna cut that out. Next, we're going to go to the driver's side differential mount. So you have a factory locating pin, we need to cut that off. Now that we're pretty much done with cutting stuff, we're going to start with some of the reassembly. So we're going to start on the passenger side, putting that axle mount in. We're going to drop these bolts back through. I'm going to slide this mount back up into place, and then we can reinstall those factory nuts. Next, we're going to take those two 18mm and tighten this back up. So at this point in time, we're ready to reinstall our differential. So we got our pole jack staged. I'm gonna have Tony help me out. We also have both of our spacer blocks and our hardware staged as well. So we're gonna lift this up, set it on the pole jack, and then I'll show you how to get those spacers and that hardware installed. For the passenger side, you're gonna have a thicker, wider block. We're gonna place that up there, and you're gonna use the longest gold bolts that they give you. You're gonna get a flat washer on the bolt head. It's gonna go up through the bottom, and on the top, it's gonna get another flat washer and a nut. So with the driver's side, you're gonna have a thinner block. This is gonna have a cutout. That cutout needs to face towards this flange where the axle bolts onto it. You're gonna use the second largest bolts in the kit. Each one is gonna get a flat washer. These are gonna go up through the bottom and screw into those factory holes. So for these two bolts on the driver's side, we're going to use a 19mm socket to tighten those up. On the passenger side, we're going to use the 19mm socket and wrench to tighten this up. All right, right, so now that we have this back up in and everything's tightened up, we're gonna go ahead and plug this harness in while we're here. Plug that in on the end, and then you just wanna take all these spots where we pulled it out of the differential, and you wanna just plug those back in. That way this stays up nice and tight. After that, we can reconnect our vent tube, and we can get our steering rack back in. Once you get the rack in, we're just gonna put all these factory bolts back in. So the driver's side's gonna get these really long bolts. So we're gonna line that up, get those installed. So we're gonna tighten these two back up using an 18mm socket. Once the rack's in and tight, the next thing we're gonna do is reconnect our steering shaft. It's only gonna fit on one way. We're gonna pull up on that, slide it onto the steering rack, and then we'll reinstall that factory bolt. After that, we're gonna take an 11mm and tighten that up. So now we're gonna reconnect these power steering plugs. Click these into each other, make sure that you press that red locking tab back down, and then you can slide and lock these back into our frame spots. Same thing for this one over here. And we can reconnect all of these plugs on the other side. So next thing we're going to do is install our cross member. So that section that we cut, that's going to actually face towards the front. So we're going to put this up in there, get it situated, and then we'll get those factory bolts back in. Once you get all that hardware installed, we're going to tighten it up using an 18mm wrench and socket. So next we're going to install our skid plate. Now Fabtech says to attach the front to 2 factory holes, but it does not seem that anything lines up. So we do have this one hole back here. We're going to put a factory bolt in on this rear cross member. We'll get that started, and then we'll line the 2 front holes up. We'll drill holes and put in the self-tapping bolts. So if you do have 2 holes on this front cross member where this lines up, you can put those factory bolts in. Like I said, we don't have any holes that line up on the front here. So we've marked our holes. What we're gonna do is swing this out of the way, take a 5/16 drill bit. We're gonna drill our pilot holes, and then we're gonna install these self-tapping bolts. Make sure you wear safety glasses when you're drilling above your head. Once you get both of those holes drilled, we're gonna install these bolts. Now you can see that it has this little cutaway here. That's gonna eat into the metal. Each one of these is gonna get a flat washer. We're gonna use a 9/16 socket to get these in. So they give you plenty of self-tapping bolts and washers for this kit. So we have the two in. We're gonna go back and tighten this one up a little bit. You use a 15mm socket for that. Now this last hole, we're gonna drill right in the center of that with a 5/16. Then we're gonna put another self-tapper in there. So next thing we're gonna do is assemble our control arms. We do have a good amount of assembly. We have to install our ball joint, our bushings, and a grease fitting, of course. So we're gonna start with the bushings. Now you're gonna have two different size bushings. You're gonna have one of each for both ends. These larger ones are gonna go in through the inside. That way this grease fitting can grease everything in there. Now you get a packet of grease. You pretty much get a whole packet for each control arm. So before we get these in, we're gonna lube them up and then slide them in. And then we have these little sleeves to install inside of those. So let's get started. So once you squeeze a good amount on there, we're just gonna spread this around the bushing. That way when it goes in there, it'll be nice and lubed up. We won't have it dry at all. So these are just gonna press in through the end. You can do this with your hand, it's pretty easy. Then we wanna wipe that excess off. So we'll do the same thing for the other side of this control arm. Next, we're gonna install these sleeves. Now these are the large gold sleeves that they give you. So we're gonna put a little bit of grease on these. And then we're gonna slide these into these holes. And you wanna press it in until it's even on both sides. And we'll do the other side. So next we're gonna install our grease fittings. You're gonna get these little gold grease fittings. There's gonna be 4 of them. You're gonna have one for each end. So we're gonna start those with our hands, and then we're gonna take an 8mm socket, tighten them up. Now you just want to get these snug. You don't need to tighten them up too much. And do the same thing for this other side. So next we're going to do the ball joint. So this ball joint is going to come down through the top of the control arm. We're gonna have to wiggle it past the boot. So once we get that in, we're gonna use these 4 bolts that they give us. They're gonna have a lock washer on here. This is gonna go on the bottom. So we're gonna drop these down through the top, install those lock washers, and then we'll put the nut back on. We're gonna do that to all 4 of them, and then we'll tighten them up. So once you get all of those in, we're gonna take a 1/2-inch wrench and a 1/2-inch deep socket, and we're gonna tighten them up. Once we tighten them up, you can torque them to 29 foot-pounds. So we're going to install the little silver grease fitting that they give us in the kit. We're going to use a 7mm socket to tighten that up. So now that this one is fully assembled, we want to grease these before we actually install them in the vehicle, and you can do the same thing for the other side. So at this point in time, we are basically done with the majority of the modification and cutting to install this kit. We have our control arms fully assembled, but before we start putting any of these new parts on, I want to take a moment just to tell you a little bit about what this kit is made of, what it's going to do for your truck, and how it compares to your stock stuff. So there's two main issues when lifting a vehicle that has independent suspension. One is going to be the ball joint angles. You are adding a spacer, in most cases, to the top of a strut. That's going to push your control arms down, make a real sharp angle. It's going to decrease ride quality. It's also going to wear those ball joints out a lot faster. Another issue is your CV angle. This is your half shafts that are up front, and this is for your four-wheel drive. It's going to put those at a sharp angle. It's also going to create a lot of bind, and it's going to wear those out. So one of the nice things about this kit is it actually spaces the axle down. Now this kit comes with brand new control arms. These control arms are made from thick, heavy-duty tubing, and they actually have brand new ball joints in them. These ball joints are extended range ball joints, so it's going to reduce some of that angle and give you a little bit better ride quality. Unlike your factory control arms, these are extended range and they're also replaceable. So if they ever wear out, you can swap them out really easily, just unbolt them, throw a new one in there, and you're good to go. Now this kit is a relatively easy to install kit compared to most other kits. Most other kits, you're gonna cut a lot more out of that frame section and those cross members, and you're gonna install drop cross members as well. So you gotta take out the lower control arms and do a lot of other work that we don't need to do with this kit. And the next thing that this kit comes with is strut spacers. These spacers are gonna attach to the factory strut, and that's going to keep us from buying new struts or even taking these things apart, which is a huge hassle. These are going to bolt right on top, and they're going to maintain that factory ride quality since we're reusing that factory strut. Now that's going to pretty much wrap it up for the front. Now when we're talking about the rear is a lot easier than the front. We're going to get spacer blocks for the rear, and these are actually going to stack right in between the springs and the factory block. That's going to give us that additional height, and since we are adding length to that, they're going to give us brand new shocks as well. Those are really easy to install. We just have some sleeves to press in, and then we can put those together. So with that being said, let's show you how this gets installed and what it looks like on the truck. So the first thing we're going to do before we get this control arm installed is we're going to take a 1/2-inch drill bit, and we're going to drill out this is so that the new ball joint fits. So we're going to drill out the top of this spindle. And be careful when you're drilling to make sure that you don't hit the CV joint. So at this point in time, we're ready to install our control arm. One thing that I would like to point out is that we did install the ball joint wrong. So we had the ball joint facing this way. You'll need to spin that around and mount it to the outside. That way this cup is facing up, and you want to face these bolts up through the bottom as well. So now that we're ready to install this, we're going to reuse those cam bolts that we took out from the factory control arms. So we're going to slide this control arm in, and these bolts are going to face outwards from the inside. Now you're going to have these little plastic guides on there, and they're going to line up with the pinholes. That's going to give you a good reference point in that factory mark. So now we have this in, we're going to install our strut. So before we get this strut installed, we need to attach the spacer to the top. Now since these studs on the strut are a little long, they bottom out and they hit the bottom of the spacer. So we need to cut a little bit off. We're going to cut about 1/4 of an inch off of them, and then we're going to reuse those factory nuts to attach the spacer to the strut. So I'm going to show you how to do that right now. We're going to take a cutoff wheel and we're just going to trim a little excess off. So after you cut those, you want to make sure that this spacer drops all the way down and is going to sit flush. We're going to install those nuts. You only want to start these a few threads at a time, just because it's going to limit the amount that you can lift this up and get the next nut on. Once we get all of them started, we're going to tighten them all up, making them as even as possible. So we're going to take an 18mm wrench, we're going to tighten these up. So I'm gonna make sure that these are nice and tight, so I'm gonna get a friend to hold this still, just while we tighten these the rest of the way. So at this point in time, we're ready to reinstall that strut. You're gonna have brand new nylon lock nuts and flat washers. Those are gonna go for the 3 studs up top. So we're gonna slide this in up under the control arm, and then we'll get it attached at the top. At this point in time, we're going to reattach the lower part of the strut. So you want to make sure that this CV shaft is on the back side of this strut. Lift this section up, stick our pole jack underneath. So raise it up to where it meets, and then we'll put back our bolts. After you get those in, you can tighten them up. So next you're going to put pressure on the lower control arm. That's going to push this whole assembly up, and we're going to tighten these top nuts. We're going to use a 5/8 wrench to tighten them up. All right, so next we're gonna install our upper ball joint into our spindle. So we're gonna push this whole assembly up, make sure that our 4-wheel drive axle is not gonna get stuck. Once you get that in, we're gonna install the castle nut that comes with it. And we'll use a 19mm to tighten that up. And if you have to, you can put your tie rod back in to keep this from spinning. Next, we're gonna put our tie rod back in. So we're just gonna drop that down in there, screw that factory nut on, and then we're gonna tighten it up. So if this spins, there's 2 ways you can do it. You can hold this tip right there while you spin that with a wrench, or you can pry down on it with a pry bar and use a 21 to tighten it up. So next we're gonna tighten up our control arms. You're gonna use a 21mm wrench for the bolt head in here. That's gonna stay still. We're gonna use a 21mm socket to tighten that nut up. After that, we're gonna reattach our half shaft, our axle, to our differential. So we're gonna reinstall all those factory bolts. Once we get them all in, we're going to tighten them up. We're going to use a 15mm socket. We're just going to go around and make them all even. Next, we're going to reinstall our sway bar end link. So we're going to stick that rod up through the bottom and through this plastic sleeve. We're going to pull our sway bar down. And on the top, it's going to get a bushing. This little beveled edge is going to face down. And then we're going to put our cap with a welded nut on top. Once that's in, we're going to use a 15mm wrench and a 15mm socket to tighten it up. So we're basically done with the reassembly of this side. We do have to connect our ABS and our brake line onto our new upper control arm. So the first thing we're going to do is cut this bracket off. This is a pretty tricky thing to do. So what we're going to do is take vice grips and grab it on the edge of that bracket. And now this bracket in here curls around and grabs onto this brake line. So we're just going to gently slit this right here so we can peel this open. You're going to be very careful and make sure that you don't cut into the brake line. Now, if you don't feel comfortable doing something like this, you can simply leave the bracket on. That's totally fine. So once you cut about halfway through that bracket, you can grab a pair of pliers, and we're just gonna bend that open. That's gonna allow that brake line to come out. So you're gonna get these little wire retainers in your kit. You're gonna have 4 of them. We're gonna use 2 up here. So one is gonna go around the ABS line, one is gonna go around the brake line, and we're gonna bolt them to this little tab right here. So we're gonna use this long little silver bolt that they give you, and we're gonna put a washer on one end, and then when it goes through both of these, it's gonna get a washer and a nylon lock nut on the bottom. And we're gonna do another one around our brake line. So we're gonna mount one on the top and one on the bottom. Then we're going to use a 7/16 wrench and a 7/16 socket to tighten that up. And we're going to plug that back in up there. Once you plug it in, we're going to press that red locking tab back in. All right, so the last step for the front end is going to be to reinstall our front drive shaft. So we want to make sure that we put it in that same way that we took it out. And since we made a mark, we know that it's right. So once you get it in there, we're going to reinstall these end caps, and then we'll tighten it up. So we're going to use an 11mm to tighten these up. So now that we're done with the front, we're gonna move on to the rear. Now the rear is a lot easier than the front. First thing we're gonna do is support our axle with a pole jack. You can pretty much do this one side at a time, so we're gonna focus on this side for now. After we get that supported, we're gonna take our shock out. So we're gonna use a 21mm wrench and a 21mm socket to take this bottom bolt out. Now the top has a welded nut, so we can just use a 21mm socket. You want to place a hand on the shop for when you take this bolt out. And we'll just wiggle it out. The next thing we're going to do is remove these U-bolts. We have a spacer to put in here, so we got to take these off. We're going to use a 22mm socket to get all 4 of these nuts off. Now this should drop enough, but you may need to loosen that other side just to get it to drop a little bit. And we want to make sure that we don't pull on any of these lines, so you might want to disconnect this ABS back here as well. So once you get those nuts off, we're going to take our plate off the bottom, pull our U-bolts out, then we're going to drop the axle down. So once you have the axle dropped down enough, we're going to install our spacer block. Now the spacer block has front stamped onto it, so we're going to place that forward. We're going to place this pin down so it sits in the axle. Once that drops in, we're going to raise this back up, and we're going to realign it with our leaf spring pack, and then we'll get our U-bolts installed. So when you raise the axle up, you want to make sure that the little nub on the bottom of this factory block goes inside of this new block. And we're going to drop down our U-bolts, make sure that they're sitting in the grooves in the top of this plate up here. Then we're going to reinstall the factory bottom half. And then each one of these is going to get a flat washer from our kit, and it's going to get a large nylon lock nut. So after that, we're going to tighten these up using that same 22mm. You want to tighten these up evenly so all of them are the same. So we got our spacer blocks in, we have to get our shocks installed, but before we get those installed, we have some sleeves to press in. So you're gonna have 2 sets of sleeves. One set is gonna have a larger diameter inside. Those are the ones that we're gonna use, so they're gonna fit those factory bolts. What we're gonna do is we're gonna spray this inside with a little bit of lubricant. We're gonna use our vise to press these in. So as you're pressing these in, you want to move the shock back and forth. This is going to allow that metal sleeve to slide through the bushing. So we can go up and down, back and forth, and it's going to center itself. Then we can do the other side. So we're going to start with the top. We're going to place our new shock up through our shock mount, and then we're going to reinstall that factory bolt. Once we get that in, we're going to take our 21mm and tighten that up. After that, we're going to lower our axle down, and we're going to get the bottom shock in. And we're going to take a 21mm wrench, 21mm socket, tighten it up. So that's going to finish it up for this side. You can do the same thing for the other side of the axle. So if you didn't already grease those control arms and those brand new ball joints, you'll want to do that before you put the wheels and tires on. After that, you can reinstall your wheels and tires, torque them down to factory specs, and then you'll want to go get an alignment. After you get an alignment, you drive this thing around for a while and then recheck all of the torque on all that hardware that we installed. However, with that being said, that's going to wrap up my review and install. For more videos like this, check us out at AmericanTrucks.com.